Good afternoon, everybody. This is Louise Kenny. I think many of you know me. I have been very involved with our special events group at Encore Learning, and I will be your host today for this presentation about Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, Panic and Media Controversy. So I think some of us know what the Orson Welles broadcast was, but it's interesting to know about the media controversy and how that played into the whole thing, and also the context of the environment at that time. So our speaker is Dennis Van Task, and I'm sorry, Vanderlast. I'm sorry, my fault. Sorry, Dennis. Dennis is a longtime research and development engineer who spent his career with the Army Night Vision Laboratory in Fort Belvoir. And then he switched over to the education realm at the University of Mary Washington, their ElderStudy program of well, I love his phrase here, topics of vernacular history, people that we could identify with that are not the leaders, but more the kind of everyday folk or stories that you might not hear about. And he's done quite an extensive a series of talks on this, and this is really the talks on the bigger topic. And he's going to talk to us specifically today about this presentation and its impact on media and the context in which it was. So Dennis, I would like to introduce you, to welcome you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Louise. I appreciate the invite to come and speak to all of you and on this topic, which was a pretty newsworthy topic in 1938, around the Halloween period of 1938. This actually is somewhat of a compressed version of a longer version of this thing. So I'm going to just jump right into this and dispense with some anecdotes I normally tell at the time. If you're going to really tackle this topic, you have to be able to start with a certain point, and the best point to start is with the planet Mars. Mars is our neighbor in the solar system. It is the fourth planet of the solar system, but Mars has a certain mythological nature to it. The fact that it's red, the fact that it was named after the Roman god of war, Mars, makes it foreboding. Mythologically, you don't fool around with Mars. It's not a namby-pamby planet like Venus or Neptune. And the fact that some people in the early days conjecture that there may be life and maybe intelligent life on Mars makes it all the more foreboding. I think foreboding is the best word to use in that area. Mars was known by Chinese astronomers in the 4th century. The Egyptian astronomers were familiar with its motion. And then an astronomer by the name of Giovanni Schiaparelli noted what he called the canali, or canals, on its surface. Very poor choice of words, because the word canal and it implies some type of intelligent design and some type of intelligence on the planet. Now, these canals were later found to be an optical illusion. Here's a picture on the right. You'll see the canals in this 1877 photograph. And in the on the left, which is a Hubble photograph, and I apologize for the low resolution on these things, you don't see the canals on there, the so-called canals. They're basically an optical illusion, what we call an optical aberration. And this mistranslation as canals caused all sorts of problems because of the conjecture of intelligent life on the planet. We meet an astronomer who was trained as a mathematician, a very good mathematician at Harvard University, by the name of Percival Lowell. Now, Lowell really got into the canal phenomenon in his research, and he began to popularize this, and the press at the time began to run a number of stories in local newspapers, usually your Sunday newspapers, that talked about these canals and had a lot of conjecture about the possibility of intelligent life that may compete with us. Of course, if you deal with canals on a planet in the popular press, you're going to have gondolas on these canals, just as you have in Venice. It stands to reason, correct? So as these different images were made, and as these different aberrations were noticed in the images, it appeared that these canals were being constructed. And here's a case of a newspaper article where the Martians finish another canal on the planet. So a whole bunch of our population began to believe that these are actually being constructed on Mars. Lowell went on to start to make conjectures about the intelligence of Martians and felt that they were smarter than we in this 1916 newspaper article. So he really began to get out of his lanes, so to speak, and added more fuel to the fire on this very emotional topic. Here is a science journal at the time called Science and Industry, Science and Invention, I'm sorry, of August 1924. And they then extrapolate Darwinian evolution to Martians, looking at the lack of gravitational pull and how that affects the evolution, how that affects intelligence. So people have already assumed in these popular press articles that, hey, the Martians are there and they're real and they're smart. Salt Lake City Tribune, they estimated that maybe there's just one big plant. There's a thinking vegetable on Mars. So this was getting really wild, but this was what the press was printing. This Salt Lake City Tribune is dated 1912. Now, of course, it didn't go away even in modern times. One of our newspapers of record, the Weekly World News, that you used to probably see in your supermarket checkout lines, just about 15 years ago, claimed that the canals on Mars are full of fish. So this is the mythology that was established, and this is the mythology that was quite popularized in the early 20th century. Well, I think we spent enough time on Mars. It's best to get back to Earth right now. And if we're going to enter the Earth's atmosphere and get back into Earth, as good a place to enter as possible is Tasmania, which is a small island south of Australia. Now, the way Tasmania plays into this story is that between about 1803 and 1830, during the British colonial period, there was some wars and fights on the island between the British and the indigenous population of the island called the Black Wars. Basically, over that period of time, about 27 years, a lot of the Tasmanian population was eradicated. After World War II, historians started to use the term genocide when applied to this tragedy back in the early 1800s. So it was something that was well known in the British Isles and by British subjects. Jumping ahead to about 1890, we meet the author Herbert George Wells, or H.G. Wells, who was already an accomplished author by the 1890s. He's published about 3 popular books. And he was walking on the beach in England with his brother, and they were talking about the Tasmanian situation and what a tragedy it was. And Wells, either Wells or his brother brought up the topic of, hey, a hypothetical topic of, wouldn't it be ironic if the British Empire were brought to their knees by a higher power and destroyed? But of course, in the 1890s, the British were still riding high. And what kind of higher power could defeat the Brits? Well, they started to assume, well, hypothesize, what if an extraterrestrial being came and had many more powers than humans had and were able to totally wipe out the Brits? And they said, huh, how about Martians? So this little hypothetical conversation actually gave Wells the impetus to write a story and put a story together about a hypothetical invasion from Mars. And it eventually ended up into a book called The War of the Worlds. Now, the book itself was kind of interesting in how it evolved. It was actually serialized in magazines starting in 1897. Pearson's in the UK, and believe it or not, Cosmopolitan in the United States serialized the story. Cosmo was a lot different in the 1890s than it is today. And then it was published in book form in 1898, and it was classified as a scientific romance in the parlance of the day. Now, the basic plot of the book is pretty simple. The Martians come with special landing craft, land on Earth, and they have superior power. There's nothing the Earthlings can do to combat the Martians, and the Martians were quite bad people. I mean, they were not friendly at all, and they conquered the Earthlings until there was a crack in their armor. And that crack in their armor was the Martians weren't used to the bacteria, and they didn't deal with viruses back then, but the microbes on this planet that could attack them because they didn't have immunity. So what essentially happens to the Martians in this story is they get all killed and done in by the microbes, the smallest little bits of animal life on this planet. And they did a job that humankind could not accomplish. So there was a lot of irony in the story, and it was a great yarn. And these days, it's actually considered to be literature. So there's H.G. Wells. There's a story that starts everything. Now, newspapers have had a very long and varied history in this country. They were very, initially in the Virginia Gazette is actually still published today in Williamsburg, but they were very partisan. And they were still in a very important part of the discourse in this country. One of the purposes of the creation of a post office was to be able to deliver newspapers to people. Newspapers continued and really hit a peak in the early 20th century. We had many daily newspapers. I grew up in the outside in the Long Island area myself. And I remember even my days growing up, New York City had at least 7 newspapers, and they were very influential in getting out the news in their multiple editions during the day. Very powerful too. There was also an upstart medium that occurred. This is David Sarnoff, who was a telegraph operator for the phone company at one point, and discovers the value of radio. He creates the RCA company, the Radio Corporation of America, and initially the National Broadcasting Company. And we start to see a little competition or potential competition for newspapers. But when he creates the broadcast network, NBC, they're really not competitive in the mid-1920s. It'll take a while, but this nascent technology would rise. Now, what was America like in 1938, the year of the broadcast? We were still in the Great Depression. It looked like the Depression was going to get better for a while. Then 1937 came, the government cut back on spending, and it started to roar back again. The Depression was endemic. It was in everybody's life. You couldn't avoid it. And it was a thing that was talked about and dealt with. You also had the rise of Hitler in Europe. By the early 1930s, a number of countries in Europe knew there was going to be a war, and it just slowly started in bits and pieces. And this created concern over here. In fact, we had 2 concerns over here in this country. There were some people who were concerned with the rise of communism from the Soviet side, and then the rise of Nazism from the more of the Western European side. We had a lot of entertainment. The movies were big, and movies actually started to make into drive-ins, people's cars. But entertainment was always something that was important in this country. And in the 1930s, if you could have cheap forms of entertainment that didn't cost a lot, people took advantage of it. And one of the cheapest forms of entertainment, if you could afford a radio and had a radio, was radio. Once you made the initial economic purchase of the thing, the entertainment, the information that came through it was all free. So it very well fit the lifestyle of the Great Depression period. Now, news reporting. There wasn't very much news reporting on the radio, even in the 1930s, or at least the beginning of the 1930s. Broadcasters really relied on print journalism and essentially parroted back from the print resources, the news bulletins that were read over the radio. Until something happened, and that was the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. Charles Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped on the 1st of March, 1932 in New Jersey, and a large New York City radio station, which actually they were based in New Jersey from the Bamberger's department store company, broke the news on the air and provided 150 hours of radio coverage as the story developed. And it was a tragic story because the baby was killed. But the newspapers could not keep up with this coverage. So in 1932, there was a watershed event in terms of radio news broadcasting, but there wasn't a lot of infrastructure in the radio news empire. Then we had Franklin Roosevelt showing up on the scene and his fireside chats. He had a folksy way of communicating over the radio, even though Herbert Hoover used the radio many, many years before Roosevelt ever did. Herbert Hoover even used the radio as Commerce Secretary. He regulated the radio through the Federal Radio Commission at the time, but he didn't have the folksiness that FDR had. Again, allowing people to keep up with current events through the lens of a president. So again, as I said, broadcasters relied on print journalism. You had Lindbergh, you had the FDR election, and radio started to pick up some momentum in news broadcasting. However, there was a finite amount of advertising dollars available during the Depression. The concern on the part of newspapers was, hey, the advertising will not support both radio and newspapers. And they became defensive. The Associated Press and the newspapers declared war on radio broadcasters. But even though they did that, NBC and CBS, ABC wasn't in existence at the time, set up news operations, very primitive news operations, but news operations nonetheless. This resulted in a temporary truce called the Biltmore Agreement on the 11th of December, 1933. The networks agreed to cease original news gathering and limit their newscast to 2 5-minute news bulletins per day, so that people who are radio listeners, invalids, shut-ins, and the blind could hear the news. And there'd be no advertising on these newscasts. Well, this Biltmore Agreement didn't last a very long period of time. And one of the reasons why there were winners and losers in this field. If you were a paper like the Chicago Tribune in Chicago, you already owned a radio station. So you did not have the defensiveness to want to fight radio. You can actually make money with radio in addition to the money you're making with your print newspaper. There were a number of newspapers, many newspapers, most newspapers did not have radio stations. And then another event occurred in 1934. This is after the Biltmore Agreement. There was a passenger ship called the SS Morro Castle, which caught fire right off the Atlantic coast, or the New Jersey shore. And WCAP was a small radio station in Asbury Park, New Jersey, that had some coverage. You could hear it in New York City. They basically looked out the window of their studio, saw the ship ablaze, and started impromptu reporting on this tragedy. And it was very riveting, and a lot of people in New York heard it. And again, it was another crack in the newspaper's armor. Then the big one, the Hindenburg fire, in New Jersey. You know, all these things are happening in New Jersey. the Hindenburg fire, which you're all familiar with, but there was a famous broadcast of the "Oh Humanity," the very emotional description of the fire by Herbert Morrison, who was sent to the site of the Hindenburg landing to just interview some passengers coming off. Well, he never got a chance to do that. What was interesting about this broadcast, it wasn't aired live. It was recorded and then aired in Chicago the next day. But it was so riveting, even though it was aired in Chicago when people had already heard the next day about the Hindenburg fire, that it was almost like it occurred all over again. The storytelling via the radio and the imagination you have listening and not seeing the image really impressed people in Chicago. And then this broadcast was then repeated all over the place. Again, another crack in the newspaper's armor. And then, of course, we had Germany annexing Austria in March of 1938. CBS and NBC had Edward R. Murrow and William Shirer over there. And via shortwave link, they were able to bring some almost near real-time immediacy into American homes, and sometimes actually real time, depending on how well the shortwave links are working at the time. Again, radio stepped up to the plate, and newspapers couldn't match the immediacy here. Then what radio did, and this was at the behest of the Luce organization and Time magazine, was Luce wanted to promote his magazine and decided to sponsor a program called The March of Time, which ran from 1931 to 1939, and it was a dramatization of news events of the day. It became very popular. I think it was on CBS, became very popular. After about the first year, Luce wanted to pull out because he had accomplished what he wanted to do, but CBS continued with the broadcast for many years because they were so popular and garnered advertising dollars. Again, this was not real news. This was real news dramatized by actors. Again, something newspapers couldn't do. September of 1938, something else happens. Two things happen. The German annexation of the Sudetenland happens. And people in this country now realize we're really on the path to war. It's going to happen. We don't know. We have to start taking care of ourselves. Maybe one day we're going to be having blackouts over here. So the nervousness, the level of nervousness was increased. And then the great hurricane of 1938, which swept up the East Coast unannounced and by surprise, and did a lot of damage on Long Island and Rhode Island and southern Massachusetts, again scared people. So there was a lot of nervousness in the air in September of 38, 1 month before the War of the Worlds broadcast. Now, the radio was forming its own personalities that were very popular with people. Yes, there were very good newspaper reporters, but they didn't seem to resonate in popularity with the personalities that radio was forming. Here we see Bob Hope, Arthur Godfrey, a local person who essentially started his career on what is now WTOP locally, local Virginia. And when they actually had their transmitters in Arlington. And then we meet another person who really makes his mark by the name of Orson Welles. Now, Orson Welles had sort of a bitter young life and lost his parents early. He was born in 1915. He had an affluent childhood, but unlucky. Some of his relatives took him under their wings. He got the opportunity to travel at age 15 to Ireland, to Dublin, and was exposed to theater, Irish theater. It fascinated him. I don't think he ever got any acting experience there, but he took it in like a sponge. He comes back, and a number of people realize that this guy has talent. He really absorbed something from the Irish, in particular Thornton Wilder, Alexander Woollcott at the time. He meets at age 19 a expat Brit by the name of John Houseman. John Houseman comes over here as a salesman. He's probably what you call these days as an undocumented immigrant, and decides to stay here and gets the theater bug. And is quite good at it, like Welles, both in acting, directing, and actually writing. At age 20, Orson Welles gets a spot on the March of Time, and he appears on many of the editions of the March of Time as an actor. And he's good, and people realize his talent right off the bat. He develops a partnership with Houseman. You may remember Houseman from the movie The Paper Chase. He's the curmudgeonly law professor. He develops a partnership, and they work on both, primarily on Broadway at the time. During the Depression, they are able to take advantage of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration Federal Theater Project, and they start to work with Negro units of the theater project. They produced a black version of Macbeth called Voodoo Macbeth, and he was age 20 in that one. He directed that. They produced, actually wrote and produced a play called The Cradle Will Rock, which is quite controversial because it was regarded to be socialist. And as Welles got the job with the March of Time, he began as a very young man to shuttle between the radio and theater. But radio was centered in New York at the time, the theater was centered in New York, so he could do it. The Cradle Will Rock was extremely controversial. The theater was actually locked and closed, so it couldn't be presented. They immediately went to a basement of another building and ended up with a extremely exciting production, as reviewed by this reviewer at the time, Archibald MacLeish, in June of 1937. Now, there was a very popular magazine at the time, published by actually edited by H.L. Mencken and George Nathan, called The American Mercury. If you were in the in crowd, if you were considered to be an intelligent person in the 1920s and early 1930s, you read The American Mercury, and so did Orson Welles. There were copies of it around his apartment. He decides to use that name and create something called the Mercury Theater. And they had their Julius Caesar play to introduce it in 1937. And what he did is he took Julius Caesar and basically set it in a Nuremberg environment. Nuremberg is where Hitler was having a lot of his rallies at the time, and there was some special lighting, searchlights that were aimed up to the air, and a lot of yelling and chanting. And he brought this milieu into the Julius Caesar play, and it was considered to be very avant-garde and very successful. He goes on to direct other plays, including Shoemaker's Holiday, Heartbreak House. He makes the cover of Time magazine at age 23. So we see a really precocious genius here. CBS makes him an offer on June of 38 because they're very impressed with his March of Time acting in the broadcast. And they create a summer fill-in called First Person Singular, a series of radio plays as a summer fill-in when certain regular programs are on hiatus. They didn't do repeats back then like they did in television starting in the 1950s. By the way, the repeat was something created by Desi Arnaz when Lucille Ball was pregnant and didn't have new episodes to show. Anyhow, the focus of these plays was on public domain plays, public domain stories. They were run Monday nights, and he eventually retitled it The Mercury Theater of the Air when they renewed it. It turns out the CBS executives pretty much liked those 9 plays during the summer, and they felt that this could possibly stand on its own in the normal primetime radio schedule. The only thing when they selected a spot for him in the radio schedule, they selected the 8 o'clock slot on Sunday, a time at which on NBC, the Chase and Sanborn Coffee Company ran something called the Chase and Sanborn Hour, which was extremely popular. It had a big following. And Chase and Sanborn Hour was hosted by a ventriloquist by the name of Edgar Bergen. Most of you probably heard of him. and he had his puppet or dummy by the name of Charlie McCarthy. This garnered the lion's share of radio listeners at that time. So Orson Welles had a real uphill task to overcome, and he never did quite overcome it. Now, the Mercury Theater of the Air, the type of shows that they would air would be shows like these: Treasure Island, Lone John Silver, Tale of Two Cities, Oliver Twist. Quality entertainment. In fact, a lot of school teachers either required or encouraged their students to listen to these shows because there was, you're dealing with literature here. But again, when you have something that's too highbrow, it's not going to garner a lot of listenership. Meanwhile, Wells was working on two plays on Broadway back in the theater, Too Much Johnson and a play called Danton's Death. Now, Danton's Death was having problems. In rehearsal, it was not going well at all. And it was requiring more and more of Orson Welles' time to pay to it to be able to hopefully launch a successful opening night. Now, at the time, it was decided and approved by Welles that one of the stories that would be aired by the Mercury Theater of the Air was The War of the Worlds. A gentleman by the name of Howard Koch was chosen to adopt the book, and initially it was hopeless. Some people said, "Hey, this is the stuff of comic books. This is not the caliber that this show requires." Anyway, he went on and tried to write it in the first person as if it was happening in real time. And that's a hard thing to do. It was such a hard problem that John Houseman had to get involved and do rewrites. Now, Orson Welles was not involved in this. He really didn't pay too much attention. He was totally wrapped up in Danton's Death. Well, the script, even under Houseman's expertise, wasn't doing well. On the Thursday before the Sunday air date, they made changes. The passage of time was modified, and they started to write it as a news broadcast. And one of the things they did, which was very atypical for this show, the show was about an hour, with commercials and breaks and stuff like that. And normally at the 30-minute point of the hour, there'd be a commercial break and station identification. They couldn't get the two acts to line up in length. So the first act was actually longer than the second act. And this is very rare, and it's a very important thing to note. They went and hired the actor Frank Reddick to mimic the Hindenburg broadcast. The script was reviewed by the CBS legal department, interesting, and they were more concerned about actual names. They did not want to use names of organizations and certain people in there. Ben Gross of the Daily News interviewed one of the Mercury Theater of the Air actors and was told, just between you and us, it's a lousy play. The show is going to bore people to death. And he suggested that Gross not even waste his time listening to the broadcast. Listen to Charlie McCarthy, Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy instead. So it wasn't going well. The script was then sent to Orrin Nichols. Now, Orrin Nichols is an interesting person that most people haven't heard of. She was the head sound effects person for CBS, and she was good. She established some techniques that have been copied by many sound effects people since. And she was sent to help mimic the play as a broadcast, as a news broadcast, excuse me. One of the sound men who works for Nichols at the time said, "This is very dull. It's going to put people to sleep." And he told this to Orson Welles on the Saturday after the technical rehearsal. So this is like basically 24 hours before the play goes on the air. That did not make Welles feel pretty good. Welles looked at it, the script, and said, his comment, "This is the worst piece of crap I've ever had to do." Sunday afternoon, he's saying this. He goes ballistic. He starts yelling and hollering at people. He starts taking everything into his own hands and makes all these phenomenal changes to the script. One of the things he did was to start the action slow and then speed it up as the story goes on. And this turns out to be the thing that actually convinced people that was really happening. Because once you get the basic premise of the play established in the slow period, and you get wrapped up in the action happening, you don't sit there, a lot of people won't sit there and think, hey, this is really a nice yarn. This is not a piece of fiction. So at 8 o'clock on the 30th of October, 1938, they go on the air. Cue Mr. Welles. Welles delivered a shorter preamble than he normally delivers on other Mercury Theater dramas. He normally will explain the play a little bit so people understand it. He did indicate that the show would be an adaptation of the War of the Worlds book, and that it was set in an optimistic future exactly 1 year from that night, in which all of the nation's anxieties, we talked about the anxieties with the hurricane and the Sudetenland, would be a thing of the past. And it actually was, when it starts, it's followed by a fake weather report. Then, what was happening on the other network? Well, Charlie McCarthy was going on at that point in time. The Mercury Theater of the Air normally got about a 3.6% radio share compared to about 35% for the Sanborn hour. Normally the Sanborn format was a couple of songs from Nelson Eddy at the beginning, and then a Bergen McCarthy comedy routine, and then the guest star would come on. If the guest star was somebody who people weren't too interested in, many people would tune their dials away from this show after the comedy routine because they wanted to get a laugh. Now, if you tune your dials away from this show and happen to tune onto the Mercury Theater of the Air, you missed Welles' introduction, and what you are hearing sounds like a news report. And that's one of the problems. Now, there's a word hysteria, which comes from the Greek hystera, which stands for uterus. Now, back in the more sexist days of our society, it was a diagnosis that was applied only to women. And the rationale, again, very sexist rationale, was that a barren womb would lead to insanity. And in the 1930s, the word hysteria still applied primarily to women. However, after the Welles program, it started to apply equally to men. In the Welles script, after the weather report, they go to the Meridian Room in the Hotel Park Plaza in downtown New York, where they would enjoy the musical stylings of Ramon Raquel and his orchestra, typical big band music of the day. And they started into a song, and all of a sudden there was a bulletin. Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin. And this was about the explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars, cited by an observatory here in the United States. And they returned the program back to the music. Now, there was no intermission or station break at the normal point of 30 minutes past the hour. So again, this station break occurred at 40 minutes past the hour. So if you tune from Charlie McCarthy and you're listening, you got about another half hour before you know that there's a announcement that this is a piece of fiction. The disclaimers that were made during the program were at the introduction, as I mentioned. At 40 minutes past the hour, they made a disclaimer, this is fiction. And at the end of the program, at 55 minutes past the hour. So those are the disclaimers that are made, and people who listen to the full hour broadcast knew that it was a piece of fiction. Now, the qualities of the dramatization were phenomenal. It was done as a live news broadcast of the day. There was prompting to the interviewees. There was some stammering on their parts. There were dead air time, technical glitches. It made it sound like a live broadcast. And they did put accurate geographical names in, even though the organizational and people's names were changed. The giveaways is that were false names of organizations. There was really unrealistic time sequence, if you noted, and then there were inaccurate times given during that time sequence. So, if you put two and two together, it was clearly a work of fiction. At 8:30, a CBS executive tries to stop the broadcast, and Welles blew him off. At that point, they're getting a number of phone calls in at the CBS switchboard, and at a certain point, the police start showing up in the studio. At the end of the broadcast, there was actually panic in the studio, and a number of CBS, I wouldn't call them executives, but managers, wished the actors and Welles out of the studio into kind of a safe room where the police couldn't get at them. And then the next morning, the newspapers started to expound on the hysteria that set in from this play. Boston Daily Globe, the San Francisco Herald Examiner, I think, no, excuse me, that's Chicago, I'm sorry, Chicago Herald Examiner, Daily News, Detroit News, the New York Times, the gray lady, puts it right in the front page. One thing about all these newspapers, they did not have radio stations in their ownership. So they were going to make the point that, see, you can't trust radio. There's a phoniness here that caused lots of grief on the part of people. However, the Chicago Tribune, which owns a radio station, the actual story appears in a small spot on the upper right-hand corner of page 3, one column, maybe about 3 inches, on the same page that advertises women's hats. It did not have the urgency for the Chicago Tribune. So you can see the haves and have-nots as far as radio stations. And the Daily News was, I mean, they show Orson Welles in a sinister, shadowy image in front. Now, a lot of people didn't buy this. One of the Milwaukee listeners wrote in and said, only a small number of people back here took the broadcast seriously because Milwaukee is a Charlie McCarthy town. However, in Pennsylvania, one of the letters came in saying, to you, the assholes of Earth and Mars, we the people in the western part of Pennsylvania think that you're a piss-pot bastard and the rest of the words we can't think of saying. There were some believers out there. The next day, this was a picture of Orson Welles. Now, there's been a debate as to whether he was really upset about this, because he could have been in legal problems as a result of this, or as such a good actor, he was feigning being upset. And I don't know if anybody will ever know the answer to that question, because Welles brought to the grave with him. But he really appears to be contrite on the day after the broadcast and offers an apology. Now, one of the other things that happened, and that's one of the reasons a lot of people didn't think the apology was very sincere, was there was a candy bar at the time, and it still is, called a Mars bar. And they don't sell them too much in this country, but they're very popular in Europe. And when Welles went back to Danton's death, the rehearsals of Danton's death, one of the actors there made a mistake of eating a Mars bar from him, and Welles just flew off the handle. I think he either fired him or almost fired the actor. So it was bugging him. Now, one good thing for Welles was after this broadcast, they didn't have a sponsor before, and after the broadcast, Campbell's Soup agreed to sponsor the remaining season of the Mercury Theater of the Air broadcast. So he now had income coming in, and the network had income coming in from this program. And of course, after the Campbell's Soup thing, one of his collaborators said, Orson, you throw sevens all the time. And he was a bit more relaxed a few days after. Now, was the broadcast legal? The Radio Act of 1912 forbade false or fraudulent signals. The Communications Act of 1934, which actually formed the FCC, forbade signals of distress. And the FCC eventually determined that no laws were broken. Yet there were calls for the FCC to pre-censor scripts in the public interest, which of course runs into First Amendment rights. We started to see calls to close air, meaning broadcast air, to fake alarms. U.S. probes invasion broadcasts, radio play causes wild panic. The Canadians started looking into ways to ban radio horrors. And then, of course, you had the political cartoonists who were all over this like anything. Now, what was the real damage that was done? There was a politician, a senator from Iowa by the name of Clyde Herring. He used to be the governor of Iowa, and he was a senator. He jumped right in the fray and sort of an opportunist. and tried to take the banner of imposing censorship on radio scripts for the purpose of protecting young minds of children who may be listening to shows like this. It was mostly talk and very little action that came out of this. And probably one of the reasons is that kids, they did a study of kids who heard the broadcast, and they weren't upset at all from the broadcast. They were used to reading comics, Buck Rogers. They were used to even radio broadcasts like Dick Tracy, where there were crazier things that were broadcast on the air in fiction, and they didn't really make the connection of the theatrical techniques of a live news broadcast that Welles was festooning on the radio listenership here. In fact, The Shadow was another big popular program for children. Now, when the Martians landed, they landed at a spot called Grover's Mill, New Jersey, in the Welles script. And from there, they went out and created havoc. They took Pennsylvania. They killed a whole number of state troopers, allegedly, in New Jersey in the script. And what was the impact in Grover's Mills? Well, the Grover's Mills people decided to protect themselves. There was a gentleman by the name of William Dock, who was basically the Second Amendment personified, and he rose to the task, protecting the mill. His picture appeared all over Life magazine, and he was kind of made the laughing stock, and he was not very happy at that. Lots of mail came in. Mail came in to CBS, mail came into the Mercury Theater, mail came into the FCC. And there was a gentleman, and I'm going to discuss him a little bit in my recommendations for books at the end of this talk, by the name of A.B. Schwartz, who did an analysis of this mail. And if you look at the almost 2,000 letters received by the FCC and the Mercury Theater, you'll notice a few things. Most of the letters came from the East Coast, not as many from the West, because of the time difference and the fact that with the program delay, the West Coast people knew the story, knew the whole situation prior. You notice very few letters came from New England compared to some other parts of the East Coast, and that was one of the reasons was the Boston CBS station decided to preempt the show and not run it. They ran a different program. So those people didn't hear it. They may have heard it from a broadcast from Providence, but it depends if they could receive the signal or not. If you analyze these letters, the letters that were sent to the Mercury Theater, the predominant amount of them were pro-Welles, as you would expect. The predominant amount of letters that were sent to the FCC were anti-Welles, but not by the ratio of the pro to anti-Welles sent to the Mercury Theater. It was a much more closer number, much more closer ratio. So there were a lot of pro people even sending letters to the FCC. If you break those letters down even further, the Mercury Theater, for people who panicked versus didn't panic, they would normally indicate that in the letters, whether they went bonkers or whether they just took it in stride. For the no panic people, obviously, the pro-Welles people enjoyed the drama. But even in the panic people, there were more pro-Welles letters than there were anti-Welles letters going to the Mercury Theater. That's not the case to the FCC, as you would well imagine. There was more anti-Welles letters to the FCC and the people who panicked. But in the no panic ones, the anti-Welles were overshadowed by the pro-Welles. So you didn't see, even though you heard these anecdotes about panic, and there were people who panicked, there's no doubt about that. I have heard stories and I've seen documentation. It wasn't a mass hysteria. And a couple of the people who decided to look into this afterwards was a Dr. Frank Stanton and a statistician by the name of Hadley Cantrell from Princeton. Stanton went on to become the president of CBS, and he was a numbers guy. And they decided in the early days of public reaction polling, before Gallup really got established, so Gallup was around, they decided to do public polling of people. And in the case of Cantrell, he made a statement that in almost every case, fright was based on psychological insecurity due to worry over jobs, health, religion, family problems, and so on. Remember, I talked about the hurricane in the Sudetenland, and people were nervous. He did find this out from his studies. And his studies were published in a number of different editions, but there has been, after the publication of them, a lot of criticism of his studies. The critiques that there was an overuse of anecdotal content. He did a lot of class stereotyping and gullibility. He would claim certain people by nature are gullible, which is not necessarily the case. In fact, it was very interesting that a number of people at Princeton University got upset by this broadcast. Of course, Princeton was just down the road from Grover's Mill, so you kind of expect that to happen. But you would think there'd be less gullible people at Princeton University than in the population in general. And the big criticism is there was oversampling of the New Jerseyites in the database of his analysis. And New Jerseyites, again, were close to the action, as they say. If you're in Kansas, you'd have a little more time to think about this than if you were living in Weehawken, New Jersey. Now, I want to kind of give you kind of an example. This is kind of a back of the envelope analysis. If you take a look at the 1938 population of the United States, 130 million people, assuming that possibly 1 out of 4 people were listening to the radio that night, and that's probably a larger than actual number, but for the benefit of a back of the envelope calculation, if you go back to the fact that the Mercury Theater garnered usually a 2 to 3.6% share of listeners, that means that the Mercury Theater probably had about 1.2 million listeners that night. Now, there was a more accurate Gallup poll taken afterwards that did an analysis and said that 71% of the Mercury Theater of the Air listeners listened to the full broadcast. So they heard all the disclaimers in the broadcast. That means that approximately 340,000 people didn't listen to the full broadcast and were more likely to be duped by the thing. That's much less than 1 million people who could possibly, who theoretically panicked according to Cantrell. Of course, the telephone rang off the hook in many different places. There are phone calls to the police, newspapers, radio stations, and other people. William Manchester, looking at this, he says, an instinct older than the invention of language is other people communicating with their peers when there's a crisis or a problem. WJSV in Washington, D.C. WJSV is now known as WTOP. They received approximately 9,000 calls and answered 470 of them because their switchboards were jammed up. 2 local supermarket chains, I think one was Giant, inquired about sending food to New Jersey because maybe people wouldn't have access to food. The DC police were calling WJSV seeking advisory updates because they didn't have the intelligence on this. But again, 9,000 was a lot of calls, but not the predominant number of people living in the Washington area. Now, what about justice? You think about liability, particularly in the part of Orson Welles for something like this. There were claims and lawsuits. In aggregate, the lawsuits that were filed were approximately $750,000. Remember, this is 1938. This was estimated by John Hausman. There was one $50,000 claim, however, which was not awarded. Welles, as far as we know, Welles did pay one claim for a pair of shoes that somebody lost in the thing. I don't know how they lost a pair of shoes, but he did file the claim for the pair of shoes. Then there was the case of the Farrell sisters. I'm going to recommend a book to you at the end of this talk and go into more detail of the Farrell sisters. But there were 2, let's say, matured sisters who lived in an apartment in New York City, and they were convinced that the world was going to end. And they decided to put their pajamas on, go out into the street, and live their last hours. And in the case of their recantation of this whole thing, the Lord sent us to the right place. They ended up going to a bar, the local neighborhood bar, and in the process downed at least 3 scotch and sodas apiece before they realized that the world was not going to end. And they tried to issue a claim to Orson Welles to pay their bar tab. Now, in 1944, the radio station in Chile attempted to do the same thing. And this was now during World War II, another period of let's say, nervousness. And it was there was a U.S. collaborator by the name of William Steele who collaborated in the production. And the public reaction was somewhat similar to the Mercury Theater. Pardon me for using the chemicals symbol for Mercury here. There was one death, however, attributed to the broadcast, as there was a group of people who panicked and somebody did end up dying. In Ecuador, Chile, 1949, Radio Quito tried this, and things were worse then. The actual producer was Alfredo Vergara. A crowd actually stormed the radio station, combination radio station and newspaper building, and set the building on fire. There were 20 plus people who died in this thing. And the radio station and the newspaper were in ruins, and Wells was reportedly conscience-stricken at the time. At least he said that. There were other attempts. WKBW in Buffalo tried it in 1968, but of course then this was already in the folklore of the country and people really didn't get scared. It was done with higher technical standards. They wove Vietnam news in with the Martian invasion news in 1968. It was repeated in 1971, 75, no incidents. WPRO in Providence did it in 1974. They did get a rebuke from the FCC, but people took it as entertainment. It was attempted on television, a program called Special Bulletin on NBC in 1983. And of course, CBS, glutton for punishment as they are, did a program called Without Warning in 1994. And there's a screenshot from it on there. And it was basically the lowest rated show on CBS that night. And the critics said it was just plain bad. Now, Orson Welles, of course, goes on and to a very successful career. He eventually hits his watershed, his opus magnum of Citizen Kane, and makes a transition to the movies, and is very successful at it. In 1940, something interesting happens, and it's claimed as being a coincidence, but I have a hard time believing it. At KTSA Radio in San Antonio, they happened to get both H.G. Wells and Orson Welles in the same building at the same time, allegedly to be interviewed for different programs. And the way the folklore goes on this thing is that somebody said, hey, why don't we get them together and talk about the War of the Worlds? Well, it turns out that H.G. Wells initially, when it was aired, he was annoyed by it because he felt it hurt his creation. It may have taken in, the British are very class conscious. It made his creation more common, so to speak. But when the two Welleses got together, another coincidence, even in the names, they actually got off together pretty well in the program, and they agreed on the air to do a collaboration in the future. But that never came to pass, unfortunately. Percival Lowell. Whatever happened to Percival Lowell, our astronomer at the beginning? Well, he switched his interest from Mars to Venus and started making projections and conjectures about Venus. And he's said to have discovered Venus spokes, after, milking out the Martian Canal thing. And these observations could not be corroborated by anyone else. It was finally explained in an analysis by an ophthalmologist what Percival Lowell was probably seeing. There's an effect, and I've encountered it because I've done work in electro-optics and night vision technology. I've encountered it where at the right light levels and at the right background light levels, you can look into an eyepiece, an optical eyepiece, and see a retro reflection of your own retina. And you will see the veins on your retina, which are in typical Venus fashion. I should say Venus fashion. They're somewhat unkempt, so to speak. Veins just flow all over the place. And these are probably the spokes that Percival Lowell saw. And again, I have seen this effect a couple of times, but he did take and milk it for a while. The last thing I hear about the Lowells is that there was a lawsuit after his death regarding chicken thefts on his property, and we heard nothing more about them. Again, Orson Welles' accomplished career, Citizen Kane, his masterpiece. He dies of a heart attack in 1985, but before he died, he says that he really planned this to be a scary a show, and really planned it to be an event, so to speak. One wonders how sincere he was in those words in the end, but that was his story toward the end of his life. If you go up to Grover's Mills, New Jersey today, it's a little bit down the road from Princeton. You'll see monuments to the War of the Worlds broadcast. There are, I think you actually did take a War of the Worlds walk up there, I believe, on the grounds. I haven't been there, but I've met people who have been. So you can see some recognition of what happened that day. I want to end up with two quotes, and a lot of times quotes are written by listeners who wrote letters in to both the FCC and the Mercury Theater of the Air. This one is in the form of a poem. If you recall, the actual story, the Wells version of the story, has state troopers being killed. And this one starts with, 6 state troopers were lying dead when my auntie lost her head. She dashed to the phone and called the radio station, but after sundown, it ceases operation. And then this one here, which I really like, a Wisconsin female listener. Your broadcast took my safe little life in its King Kong hands, juggled it around carelessly for the space of 15 or 20 minutes, and allowed it to settle gently, again, with proper perspective and a normal proportion. Isn't that nice? What a good piece of writing that is. Okay, I normally like to, in my talks, give suggestions of books to people who would like to explore the topic further. And I normally pick about 3 or 4 books that I think I normally will use to help for my research for the actual talks, but will contain a lot of information I just can't get to in this short space of time I have to speak to you. In this case, there's only one book that is on the topic that was published and is quite good. It's called Broadcast Hysteria by A. Brad Schwartz, published by Hill and Wang. It's published about, 10 years ago or so, maybe 8 years ago. I drew heavily on this book from both some content, and also it guided me in some of the additional research I did. Schwartz was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and he happened to stumble into a few boxes of Wells papers in the library at Michigan, and he got the bug. And after he graduated, he did a lot of painstaking research, including all those analyses of the letters that I quoted earlier in the talk. And it's a very well-researched, very well-written book. It was his first book, and I highly recommend it. It also contains some of the anecdotes, like the full story of the Farrell sisters in there. So if you want to read and learn more about this, it's the best and the only book on the subject per se. But if you want to learn about Orson Welles, particularly Orson Welles' career prior to Citizen Kane, Young Orson by Patrick McGilligan and published by HarperCollins. You see how a genius at work, in my opinion, works in this book, and I highly recommend it. Now, for those of you who would like to learn about the early days of radio and how science was communicated, not science fiction, but how real science was communicated on the air, this is a University Press book called Science on the Air. And if you look very closely at this, it shows a microphone of a local radio station here, WMAL, by Marcel LaFollette. Again, this gives you the other side of the picture and how the job that radio did in communicating science, as science was burgeoning and developing in the the rapidly developing 20th century.
Okay, to our questions and answers. Please do enter your questions and answers in the chat function, not in the question and answer function, not the chat function. Vivian, why don't, because I don't have the screen up here, there was a very interesting story that somebody put as the first question on here, the first comment actually. Can you read that?
Sure. It's from Carol Ann Linder, and it says, in 1938, my grandparents lived in Rye, New York. Halfway through the broadcast, they saw their neighbors quickly putting suitcases in the car. My grandfather said, "Where are you going?" The neighbors said, "We are going to Bridgeport to get away from the Martians." Presumably the Martians were coming to Rye, but not to Bridgeport. My grandfather loved telling that story.
You know,
There you
there's
go. Go ahead, Ed.
allied with that story is very interesting, I think. I won't go into the full story, but we had a relative who actually did the same thing, packed up the family and moved away from New Jersey for at least 24 hours. But what was interesting is that in 1938, if you had a car, you did not necessarily have a radio in that car. A radio was an option, and many people opted to buy cars without radios. In fact, some people bought cars back in 1938 without heaters. So once you get in that car and get away from your home radio, you have no communication, no matter where you're driving, whether it's to Bridgeport or Boston, or in this case, he drove to Montauk Point in Long Island. But you are incommunicado, and that's something hard for us to envisage these days.
Wow. I have a question, Dennis. How old was Orson Welles when War of the Worlds happened? And my second part of it is at the time, was there any clarity about how much he's responsible for the dramatic changes in it? I mean, he kind of played innocent afterwards and was very contrite, but do we know at the time? Later on, I know it was bragging rights, but at the time.
Well, two things. Let me try to estimate that. I don't have the exact age, but if he started the March of Time at age 20, and that started in 1931. If he started right at the beginning, he could not have been older than 28. So he was in his 20s. Now, in answer to the second part of that question, he did a lot of changes to that script. And it was done on the fly, Sunday afternoon into Sunday evening, in a matter of 5 hours. But the big contribution he made to the script was changing the timing, slowing it up at the beginning, and then increasing the tempo of the dialogue as it went on. And that probably was one of the most significant contributions to the, let's say, the so-called realism of the script.
Okay. Did he also impact the timing of the break from halfway?
No, that was actually decided beforehand. It was just a matter of volume of material. They just couldn't find a good breaking point at the half hour. So that was probably more, I think, Houseman's doing than it was Welles.
Okay. Okay. So Vivian, can you take over on the questions that are posed there, because I can't see them on my screen?
Sure. So Billion Woj says this presentation was terrific. And also, what got you interested in this topic?
Well, it's kind of, I was just mentioning that before the talk. I give a lot of talks down at Mary Washington, and I like to get involved in something called, I call it vernacular history of the everyday things. And I gave a talk down there many years ago on, it's called Tales from the Dark Side. It was about the history of AM radio in this country and all the characters that populated the airwaves. I mean, there were some real interesting characters that populated the airwaves, to say the least. Quacks, there were people selling snake oil cures. There were, you probably heard of Father Conlin. He was sort of a rabble rouser leading up to World War I, somewhat pro-fascist. And I spent about 3 slides on the War of the Worlds. And the feedback I got from that talk was, can you tell us more about the War of the Worlds? So basically, that first talk, which was called Tales from the Dark Side, begat those Nettlesome Aliens. So it grew out of a previous talk.
Great. Vivian?
Someone said, I heard there was a suicide in New Jersey. Is that true?
I am not. I heard the same thing. I have not found any documentation to that effect. That's not to say it may not have happened, or there may have been other extenuating circumstances that contributed to the suicide that may not have been totally motivated by this, but I can't confirm that.
Great. Jean asks, were there actual panics in the streets?
The best I can tell, not of the panic that there was like in Ecuador. The panics were more controlled. I think it was more like the Farrell sisters, it's let's go to the bar because there's a bad times, and the types of people who got in their cars and maybe took off. I don't think there was any mass hysteria in the sense that some of the newspapers were claiming.
Okay. Someone says that Orson Welles was born in 1915, so he was 23.
Okay.
And
that's
then,
good. He was in his 20s. So that means that he finally got onto the March of Time later in the course of the March of Times programming than earlier. So yeah, that makes sense.
Another question or comment, Citizen Kane is often, I think, known as the best movie. Can you tell us more about Welles?
Well, I am to look at Welles. I was, what I would do. I would recommend a speaker on this topic. We had an excellent speaker down at Mary Washington. His name is Gary Olson. He's a retired motion picture director, and he really knows motion pictures, and he does a wonderful talk on Orson Welles. If you can, I could try to link you up with him. He loves to give live talks, though, and I don't know if he could make it up and do it, but I would suggest that's the way to really learn about Welles.
Great. Jack says, could we get a talk on Tales from the Dark Side?
I mean, I would love to do it. I just have to, since I gave it, I just have to check and make sure all of the links work in it. I did a lot of audio clips from early radio, and I can go back and check the talk, make sure all the links work, and I'd be glad to do it if you'd like to sometime.
Okay, great. CJ Collins says, can't get past the irony of ventriloquists on the radio.
Isn't that amazing? That is amazing. Yeah, it's a good point.
Yes.
I know one thing that, well, let me not go in that direction right now. It's too complicated, but yeah, it's a good point.
That's a very good point. Yes.
A few people asked about this recording. So yes, we are recording today, and it will be available sometime this week on the Encore Learning YouTube page. And then it looks like we have one more question. Are you aware?
I have one more comment after that question, so please give me the question.
Okay. Are you aware of any modern day WOTW type events?
I did know that in the early 70s and early 80s, WETA radio in Arlington used to run the War of the Worlds broadcast every Halloween. And they stopped doing it after a while. It's really interesting. They gave all sorts of disclaimers on the thing when they ran it. And if you just listen to it, you know, if you're listening to it on pristine FM radio, you hear this old scratchy broadcast. So you know it's not real. But they were very, I guess the legal department made them do that. But they used to do that. And that's the only one I remember locally. But they haven't done that in a number of years.
Okay. And then some people are asking if you know of anywhere to access the broadcast, the original radio broadcast itself.
I was just going to get to that because I was going to recommend that now that you've heard the talk and while it's fresh in your mind, if you're not doing anything tonight, you may want to listen to the broadcast. If you go and Google in War of the Worlds broadcast or 1938 War of the Worlds or War of the Worlds Orson Welles, there are a number of streaming files that come up that you just click and download, and they do have the broadcast. Now, some of them are better quality than others, and I know that if you like your own personal copy of it, it's available on CD and from many. I think you can even buy it on Amazon from CD. But you can easily download it for free. And if you're not doing anything tonight, I suggest you do it. Wait till after dark, though.
Okay, and I think that's all of them.
I do have one more question, Dennis. Was this
Sure.
lucrative from a money standpoint?
Well, it was lucrative after the broadcast when Campbell Soup signed on. I don't think that CBS made a lot of money on those broadcasts, again, since they were up against the Chase and Sanborn hour. Prior to that, I know they didn't make a lot on the summer series, and they were having trouble chasing down, let's call it stable sponsors. So I doubt there was a lot of money made on this thing.
Well, Dennis, thank you very, very much. Obviously, you struck a chord with everybody and a very entertaining and informative and fun presentation. So,
Well, it's
so
my
we thank
pleasure.
you.
I thank you for inviting me.
Well, we might be inviting you back for Tales of the Dark Side. So
Okay.
stay tuned.
Stay tuned. That's a good way of putting it.
There you go. Stay tuned. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Dennis, for a great presentation. We appreciate it.